Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of A Revolution in Education. I'm your host, Jim McCue. This is an introduction to episode 12. This week's episode is a little bit different, as we'll be talking to three different leaders in the education space about their work and outlook on the future of education. First, you'll hear from Vanessa Wilkins, founder of the Future School Lab and an expert in residence at Harvard Innovation Lab. Then you'll hear from James Harris, the former school board president of the Oakland Unified School District, and current communications advisor with 510 Media. And then finally, we're joined by Sanjili and Vanessa Gilway of Design for Change. To learn more about the Revolutionaries in this episode, make sure to check out our website, revolutionineducation.org. Without further ado, here's Vanessa Wilkins. I'm here with Vanessa Wilkins, who is the leader of a lot of great education reform and education innovative spaces. She's based out of Oregon, and I wanted to highlight Vanessa's particular work in education because of her experience in the private sector in pushing for innovation in education, the role that might play in reforming both the public and private sector in education. She'll also lend some insight on the global perspective and the importance of sharing across sector borders. And then finally, it would be with much regret if we didn't get to dive into her personal history, what has shaped her view of education so far, and then moving forward. And then we'll close with some fun questions. Vanessa, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much, Jim. Very fun to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm so appreciative. For the audience listening and watching from home or wherever you find yourself enjoying this content, Vanessa and I connected late last year. I'm really grateful to have her now as a trusted friend, mentor, and just collaborator in the thought space of education reform and innovation. What was your experience like growing up in education, in schooling? How did you find yourself relating to others? Was it a comfortable space for you?
Yes. So I would say, I had a sort of very middle class, kind of traditional public school upbringing in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon. And I wouldn't say that I had a great experience, but I also didn't have a bad experience. Like, it wasn't that memorable. So I would say it was unremarkable in that way, but I was really lucky because I still had, the support of my family, and I had good friends, and I probably have like traditional intelligences in terms of being able to, succeed in like what they call book smarts. I could read the book and still ace the test, even if I read it the night before. Kind of those kinds of skills. And I had obviously the culturally relevant upbringing of being a white middle-class young woman in America in the 1980s growing up. So it wasn't bad. It wasn't great. I don't think that that's why I went into education. I think more than anything, it left me feeling dissatisfied and feeling like, this is it. Couldn't it be better than this?
And this is a theme that I've found resonate among other educators that we've been able to speak with, is that sometimes the void of having a really quality, like standout educational experience as a student leads us to become the leaders that we are in education now. And so that exposure to different aspects of learning outside of the traditional approach, sometimes not having that is enough to encourage you. It's an impetus to get into the work that you are now doing. Do you want to talk a little bit more about maybe just after college, maybe some of the work that you did in an early job in Venezuela or with Friends of the Children, or wherever you want to take it next?
Yeah. One reaction to what you just said, I think that's totally true. And I would say that for example, the high school teacher that I remember most was somebody who came down on me in a really negative way. He actually told me I had the worst body language you'd ever seen. And it was like, oh, I was finally seen, positive or negative. I was really happy to pay attention, as like a quiet girl in class.
Yeah.
And that had a huge impact. And I turned my sort of attitude around. Being seen is important.
Absolutely.
Whether it's positive or negative feedback. So after school, I graduated from college and was very uninspired by like the business kind of corporate stuff that was at the job placement office for finance majors. I just thought, oh my gosh, that sounds awful. That's what you're going to do for your job, And so I thought, well, I'll go home to Oregon and find a job. And I remember going to an interview at an insurance company, which I was well qualified for, insurance company in Portland, Oregon. And I had a really good GPA from BU. And I remember feeling like I aced the interview. He asked me what IRR was, all these financial things, and I nailed it. And the guy told me I should start as a admin assistant. And I thought, that doesn't seem right. And looking back, I don't think that would have been the case if I had been a male Victor instead of Vanessa, right? So I went home and I had met at a BU graduation event. I had been fortunate enough to be in the same room with an entrepreneur from Venezuela who ran a company that had all these different corporations under it, but also had a huge social sector. So they actually had universities, hospitals, housing, schools, all sorts of social programs, because it was a nationalized economy back then. And he noticed me because I received some scholarships that were all need-based, but I still was awarded them at this ceremony that he was speaking at. And he, gave me his card and said nice things. And so after I had this awful interview at an insurance company, I called him up, and actually back then you couldn't even use the phone, right? I sent him a letter in Venezuela, which took a month to get there, and ended up getting this job in Venezuela, which I was really lucky to have because it was an incredible experience. And I'd say that that's one of the things that's formed, I guess, my thoughts about what's important for kids. And it was that, this small girl from Portland, Oregon went and worked in Venezuela, and this idea of cultural exchange and how going outside of our comfort zones it's totally transformational. I think cultural exchange, whether it's down the road or in a town that's really different from you, or in a different country, or in just an environment where you feel uncomfortable, it's so valuable because you don't just learn about people in different communities or countries across the world. You also see, it's like a mirror. You see yourself so much more clearly. It just shows you how different things are. And I know you've experienced that in Somalia and some of the incredible work that you've done, Jim, with kids, taking kids out of their comfort zone and that's
truly.
who I am. That's what my country's like.
And I thank you for mentioning some of the work that I've done. And I truly reflect on that often. And, I grew up in a very homogeneous town. And so you went to school with students that very much looked like you and came from the same perspectives and cultures. And sometimes with that, you have this trap of meritocracy where it's believed that the way that you get ahead in life and education is simply through all the actions that you take unattended by or uninfluenced by some of the other societal or cultural impacts that happen, whether it's historically or politically, or, there are so many factors that influence a child in a classroom beyond just them sitting there attentively. And so I think about that and the relevancy and the importance of cultural exchange.
I've always seen education as really like a driver for equity. And I didn't probably use that language in the past. I said things like it's the pathway out of poverty, or education is a great equalizer. My white privilege has put me in a place where the education ecosystem has served me well, right? And I think that should be true for all Americans, and it has not been. It's my opinion that our system is no longer, quote, fit for the purpose that it was intended, right? I mean, it was kind of created to sort kids out so that they could fuel a few kids into these white collar jobs. And they were white men back then. I mean, that was what the system was created to do, sort and separate kids into different careers. Innovation is happening in the private sector, whether we like it or not. Often, and I think it's sort of amoral in its activity because of our capitalistic society. And so I think in the public sector and education specifically, need to sort of figure out how to harness that ability to innovate and learn from what's happening in the private sector to inform what our kids need to solve the problems of the future. I think the reason we need collaboration is that we're all in this together. And there are some solutions in the private sector, some capacity for innovation, some capacity for change, and even for just leadership that isn't easily accessible in school. So for example, at Nike, we did fund important improvements in education. We actually funded a program called AVID in a statewide expansion across Oregon. But we also paired up executives at Nike with school leaders and then sort of let them innovate. And those partnerships were really important because people started to see, similarity in terms of the leadership, how you lead a school versus how you lead a division at a company, for example. It's all about people at the end of the day and inspiring them in your vision. That's leadership, right? And then they also, I think, exchanged some really important ideas about innovation, about, what kids need for the future. All sorts of different things and beautiful things came out of that partnership. And I remember one conversation with a really amazing superintendent who had been in education for years. And we were having this sit down lunch, just talking about programs for the next year with him and a couple of executives at Nike. And he said, I'm just really curious. We're trying to innovate so desperately in our school district, which is a pretty big one in Oregon. And I, want your advice. Like, how do you guys approach innovation? And one of the leaders from Nike said, we have whole teams whose entire job is to do that. All they do is worry about the future. And there's a completely separate team running the sort of business of today. And schools don't have that. And I know some of them have tried, but I think most school districts are really busy dealing every single day with kids virtually or in person, walking through the door, who have a lot of very different needs. And that's where their focus is, and that's where it should be, right? And so how and when are you supposed to think about systemic changes that you want to make for the next year?
Private sector innovations that can be applied to the public sphere, especially in education. And one that comes to mind is this notion of distributive leadership. And it even comes down to taking stake of and having really great feedback cycles for students to incorporate their own voice and their own identity in school culture. So I do want to touch on that, but I am also mindful of how we can be more thoughtful in the process of establishing what is not just an assumed difficulty in the classroom, because we know that teachers there's so much responsibility that's put on their plate. They're not just teachers, they're role models, they're support structures. It is truly a community effort. And if teachers are going into the classroom and wanting to be innovative or think in a very novel way, it's really hard when you have some practices and procedures that are set up in a bureaucratic way. But those are intended to be best supportive and document for students. But I've had a recent situation with a teacher who had mentioned this teacher really wanted to attend to the social emotional needs of their students, but data was of such an importance. And there was a student that hadn't been showing up to virtual engagements. The student had showed up. All attention just went to that. And sometimes priorities are not intentionally misguided, but they are sometimes. And so offering that opportunity for teachers and students to explore that space together is so beautiful. And that's what I find really inspiring about your work now with Future School Lab. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Future School Lab we call it a social impact venture to accelerate innovation in education. But really it comes down to, we do some consulting projects, which are really varied. And that's one of the ways that I met you. Jim has plugged in on one consulting project that's been very fun. And he helped us listen to student voice, which was relevant to this conversation. As I said, I live in Oregon. This is where I grew up and where I've come back to after Venezuela, New York, and Boston, all these places. And it is the place that I love and the place that I want to have the biggest impact on. And yet, I believe strongly that we have things that we could learn from other states, other countries, other models. And so we've tried to be sort of an intermediary for good ideas. We call them novel, not invented here, but applicable elsewhere, that could be adapted to Oregon. And then finally, we do thought leadership or fun things participating in this podcast or speaking in Australia or some of those things. So luckily at this point in my career, I've been able to sort of do work I love and measure things on is this going to have an impact? And am I learning something? So in my own professional development now as a 51-year-old woman, I'm lucky enough to sort of say I can prioritize that way. I can, spend a significant amount of my time on volunteer efforts that I think are really important. And yeah, I feel very grateful to be in that position, especially given today's economic and pandemic situation for so many.
Oh, so true. I mean, one of the things that stands out about your work is that you have always focused on changing the narrative. And I think as folks that appreciate data analysis, and all teachers do, they want to do what's best for their students, empirically speaking. There is a need to overcome that tendency to focus on the data, because we're not inspired or motivated by data. We're inspired by the stories told through that data. And so you talk about models and the existing mental models, whether they're biased or they're stuck in a more traditional approach, or they're well-intended but just simply misguided because there's not enough professional development. I mean, what are the things that stand out from schools that you really love speaking highly of, or that you've worked with, that really resonate and would be really valuable for our audience today?
We all sort of have this vision of school and a schoolhouse and a classroom that is devoted to an hour block for math and 47 minutes for English or whatever we do. Those models are hard to change. And I think it's been hard for innovative school leaders to convince parents and students and legislators and business people that school should be really different. But it's all kind of that idea of how change happens, and you have to change mental models first. So changing the narrative around what's possible and what schools could be, I think, is really important. And some of the places where I've seen that go well in either different countries or here in the US, I mean, a lot of it's leadership. And I think leadership to me is setting a clear vision and communicating that clearly to your different stakeholders. So when you see a community that really has a clear vision of what they want for their students and what their school stands for, I think that's when the change is possible at the school level or the district level or even the state level. And some examples of that, I mean, even Finland, they are notably good at educating children and have done a lot of things right, but they aren't resting on their laurels, and they redesign and redo their curriculum, their national curriculum. I think it's every 4 years. It's really an ongoing continuous improvement process. And one of the things that they did, I think it was 2014 or 2016, was adopt a whole sort of holistic set of skills that students need for the future. And they're really different. It's like, if you looked at those, it looks very different from our standards of reading and writing and things that you can measure. It's things about self-awareness and understanding of self and understanding of sustainability in the community. And when they talk about like literacy skills, they talk about multi-literacy skills, meaning that you're able to understand visuals and graphics and not just words on a page written 100 years ago. So there's a lot of like very good thinking that's gone into those. And it's one of the few, I think, large systems that's been successful at doing that.
I would love to hear your thoughts on how we make sure that we are attentive to student needs in all the multiple dimensions of what that manifests as. And I know that's a very broad question, but maybe you have the answer that'll help us out.
I go back to, I worked at an organization called Friends of the Children along the way, and I've actually stayed involved with them for many, many years as a board member. And Friends of the Children is a pioneering mentoring organization. And one of the founders, Oren Bolstad, he was a researcher who partnered up with Duncan Campbell to create this new model for mentorship that essentially hires professional and trains professional mentors to work with the most at-risk kids. Oren talked about resiliency and I think that the research is still relevant. It's probably changed a lot since then, but I've always remembered the three things that can change the trajectory of a child's life are: one, a caring adult. It is the most impactful thing that you can do. Unconditional love from someone who is there for you on a consistent basis over time, not just in one class. It could be a teacher, but it needs to be over time. Two is that like out of your comfort zone experience. Like I talked about cultural exchange and how that's so powerful in terms of learning because you see yourself. It's also powerful because you're out of your comfort zone and you realize you're stronger than you think. And then the third thing that builds resiliency is developing a competency and a passion in something. And so realizing that spending time on something, you get better at it and you can build skill along the way. And then also having that like pride that comes with your confidence and competency at something is really resiliency building. And so I think those three things, like we should be thinking about those now. I remember touring a school in a small town in Oregon, Dayton, Oregon, public high school in a agricultural community. And when I went to tour the school, one of the conversations I had was with their CTE teacher who taught like manufacturing skills. They had an incredible area that had like higher level mechanical tools that kids could use. And the instructor was telling about one kid that he had that they just could not get him to pass English. And he'd struggled and struggled, but he was this incredible metal worker. And he said, you know what? Why don't you take your English test in the lab? Because it smells. He's like, we underestimate how much the environment impacts kids. And sitting in a classroom was so uncomfortable for this kid. Like he'd learned that to hate education so much, but he loved being in the CTE lab. And so he's like, being around the smell of oil and the smell of mechanics and all the machines in here will help him. And so the English teacher said, sure, he can take his final exam in there. And he said he did the best he'd ever done. Like, it totally worked, being in this comfortable environment. This teacher, knew him and respected him. And this kid aced his exam.
I truly see passion in your voice and the work that you've done, having worked with you previously, but also the stories that you laid out for us today about your experiences, those that you've connected with. Vanessa Wilkins, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today.
Thank you so much, Jim. I love your podcast and what you guys are doing. So it's been wonderful to get to know you over the last year. And I'm just grateful for this time and for our continued friendship.
Thanks. Take care. Welcome to another episode of A Revolution in Education. I'm your humble host, Jim McCue, along with Chris Unger, the originator of this revolution and the media that you're listening to, viewing right now. We are here today with James Harris, someone who I've had the opportunity to work with out in Oakland. He was the District 7 representative on the Oakland Unified Board of Education in California. He first started serving in that role in 2012 and just finished up. So we want to explore what he's working on now. Beyond just his work in education, he started in advertising and marketing, a truly innovative entrepreneur. He spent some time teaching, in fact, as well. He earned a bachelor's degree in communications from Santa Clara University. Him and his wife have 2 beautiful children. James, welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good.
Good.
I'm out here in Philly, and Chris is a little north of me, up in Massachusetts. So we're dealing with some snow. A little bit jealous of you right now and the short sleeves that you're wearing, but it's good to be in conversation with you. How are you?
Man, things are well here in Oakland. It is strangely, I think, going to be 80 degrees again today. So just unbelievable. So yeah, I'm doing pretty well, all things considered. Good to
hear. James, a lot of the format that we focused on this season has been looking at the past of and the educational experiences of these leaders that we're having conversations with. How is that a formative process for them to be in the roles that they are now? What they're currently working on, and how have their experiences, their perspectives, and their mindsets influenced that? And then looking towards the future, what are things that you want to actualize? What needs to be true for that to be realized? So we'll start with this. Where did you grow up? What was your educational experience like? Are there certain role models or teachers that come to mind that brought you to the space?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. And, what brought me to the space really was people that loved me. I am just a product of people that stepped in and cared for me. And that started, with my immediate family when, I think everybody born in the 70s is a product of divorce. But so my parents divorced, and my dad was probably among the first single parents. But the support I got from my aunts, from my grandmother, from my cousins, and I mean, just in saying, we're going to wrap arms around this boy and make sure he has everything he needs. So I saw that example early on, and you never really know the things that impact you as they impact you. But, kind of the first job I had was at this summer program called Aim High. I was 16 years old, and I was working as a teacher's assistant. And I was like, man, this is great. You get to work with kids. You get to hold kids accountable, and you get to see the magic in their eyes when they understand something. And so I remembered always, like, being in that classroom as a TA, like that was the magic of learning. Miss Benford was my science teacher in 5th grade, and just remembering how she was so excited about the Space Shuttle Challenger. We all know how it ended, but I just saw the impact that it had on her. I just really just reflected from that position on all of the beauty that teachers bring to the work and the magic that happens when teachers and students connect. So, I think somehow through all of my work, whether it was board service or whether it was teaching in a classroom or working at a summer program or going to my wife's class to talk about a history lesson or something like that, I've always just found a need, deeply personal need, to just be engaged in the classroom, being engaged in education. And so that's kind of what's driven me the whole time is that, like, students just keep going, right? And we continue to have an opportunity to impact them in ways that we can't even imagine. And I've just seen so many students go on to do such amazing things, and remembering them as a sophomore and just seeing how brilliant they become. I'm driven by the work mainly because I think teachers are the most awesome people in the world. But here in the States, I don't think we value them as they should be valued. So I think that's part of, to mention what Chris is talking about, the revolution. We need that kind of revolution that really uplifts teachers. So I think that's definitely at the core of my political interest in education.
I definitely hear that. And I've seen that from you in working with others. I was telling Chris, you are very engaging. You command a room in a way that's very inviting. You are extremely gregarious, and relationships count for you. And I saw that when you were working as the president of the school board in Oakland. You mentioned politics and the influence there. Do you want to describe to whatever extent you want to, the successes that you've had throughout the last several years in that position, maybe some of the productive challenges and where you see it now after having left after 2 terms?
Yeah, I think a lot of the success we had at the board level is stuff that you never see. And it's simple things that when you look at an organization like Oakland Unified that spends just over $3 million a day with a total budget of about $700 million, and you think of LA, you think of San Francisco, they're bigger, right? They're in the $1 billion category, and to think that the superintendent before we got started didn't have a work plan. That there was not an evaluation process for the superintendent, that the board itself didn't evaluate itself and didn't reflect on a vision for the district. All of those things happened, early on in my term. I was really, really guided, and I think, positively guided by a dude named David Kakashiba, who in a lot of ways was a mentor for me. And he'd been on the school board for like 12 years. And he was like, man, I've never been able to get traction with any of this stuff. You think we can start to move in a direction where there's actually systems and structures. And so, those things behind the scenes, really creating the culture where the superintendent can actually start to do work and start to create some level of consistency. Those are the reasons that, Kyla Johnson Trammell, the current superintendent, is going to her 5th year, the longest serving superintendent in over 3 decades. I mean, so it's like, our goal behind the scenes was to try to establish some sort of stability in Oakland. And, Oakland just has not been a place of stability. I don't know if you remember that, Jim, but that's been one of the challenges. And so that was one of the levers we tried to pull. Kind of another indicator, just real quick. I think some of the best work we did was passing 2 parcel tax measures. So I sound like a politician, I know, but what we did is we created some safeguards and community accountability. So each of them has a community oversight body by where members of OUSD staff actually appeal to this citizen-driven committee with the ideas, to seeking continuation of funding. They have to get the approval of not only the school board, but of a citizen oversight committee. We noticed that parcel tax dollars, we weren't getting maximum effectiveness. And this was one of the structures we put in place to do that. To the point of the parcel tax measure G1 was a shot in the arm. It actually, part of it, about $5 million a year of it, is salary for teachers. In our effort to retain, and maybe we can talk about some of the challenges I see with teacher salary. And then the large bulk, 65% of it actually serves middle school improvements. So middle schoolers are now able to do the things they couldn't do before, whether that's language programming, whether that's arts programming. Those things are possible. So a school of size, maybe 700, is now getting $300,000 to $400,000 more a year to serve and offer those things that middle schoolers need, in addition to their core curriculum. Measure N, was another parcel tax. It's about $120 million over a 10-year span, and it allows high school students to directly engage with the things they believe they want to do when they get out of school. So, a kid does their so that we've pathways wall to wall here in OUSD, and that means every kid that's enrolled gets that opportunity. And so, one example in the health pathway, kids doing school in the morning, they complete their core subjects, they work hard enough, they've established an internship with the local hospital, they're then able to scrub in, put on the scrubs, and then follow and work with a nurse for the rest of the day. And so that's happening for hundreds of kids in Oakland. And so they're able to get those opportunities in spaces like engineering, hospitality. And then we felt it important to also open up pathways in the space of non-traditional, right? College stuff, right? We believe that if kids want to be auto mechanics, they can work on a BMW and get $200 an hour, right? So why not be an auto mechanic? So, we were all about opening up those pathways. I think those are some great successes. I could count high school graduation rate improvements. We went from 60% to 75% in the time I was on the board, but there's nothing to write home about. Like we're still missing one kid, right? And so what are we doing to close that gap? Continues to be the driving question for me.
That everything that you just said is poignant to me, just simply because of the accountability and the support to keep people in Oakland. I mean, you started off by talking about Kyla, and she's been there now longer than many of her precedents, those prior to her term there. And I think about the investment in the lifeblood of an education system, and that's teachers. And that's the heart of where I want to direct this conversation. And you mentioned, G1 in $5 million going to salary and supporting teachers, because we know that we all have a passion to do this work, but especially due to this pandemic, we're now seeing the amplification of how difficult it truly is to be a teacher and an educator. And you have to do so much just being on that one hat. And so you wrote this beautiful piece that we'll link in the show notes recently about a new deal for education. And the essential question is, what if we invested heavily in teacher salaries and teacher professional development? I see that as your addition to the revolution. And Chris, you're more than welcome to pop in here. But I would love for you, James, to outline to us what that looks like for you, where you see it going, and Chris, if you have anything to add.
Take it away, James. Give us the, tell us
Give
all
you the
about
skinny.
it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, check out. So, part of leaving the board, I started this introspection project, and maybe it lasts 3 months, maybe I can last that long doing them every week. But the thing that I write about in this one piece, the thing's called Town Biz, is it was a book I read like almost a decade ago. I'm so old. Like it was maybe 13 years ago. And don't say nothing, Chris, because I'm old, man. I feel old. So, but Joseph Stiglitz, a dude, an economist I've always been super inspired by his perspective, wrote a book called The $3 Trillion War. And, he's taken Bush to task on, why are we spending $3 trillion on this when healthcare is outstanding? And he has a laundry list of things that we could do. I believe he mentions education. And if you look at the history of this country in terms of large scale stimulus investment, it's always in the form of recovery from an accident. So we're going to invest because, Katrina, okay, well, the economy failed. We got to stimulate. And now we're to the point where we're writing, $1.2 trillion checks like it's the dinner bill. And so I'm saying, well, since it's the dinner bill, why can't we invest $1 trillion proactively in creating? If you put $1 trillion on the table and you said, you know what, we believe our children are that important, but we also believe that we are underpaying our teachers, and that there needs to be a national conversation about how the return on investment plays out. Why aren't we having that conversation? Why in Oakland is the average teacher salary $46,000 a year? And we're asking ourselves, well, why are kids, both the district and district run and charter schools, but we're reading at 3 out of 10, African-American kids are able to do math at a 20% level, and we're paying teachers $46,000 on average a year, and we're asking ourselves, why are we getting these results? And it's you know, I'm included, right? I'm a part of this culture that romanticizes everything that's not education, and doesn't allow an investment that actually speaks to the importance of teachers. Certainly doctors are lifted up, lawyers are lifted up, and even nurses have an out path where they can make in the upper 6 figures. But we haven't created those same pathways to the people that educate our children. And so that's not just classroom teachers, that's janitors. The people that work for special education students in Oakland, would you be surprised if I tell you they're making $18 to $25 an hour? Wait a minute, to take care of our most precious children. So, I just think there has to be a larger conversation about our priorities. And that comes with a level of honesty that we seem rarely equipped to showcase and have as we get into that conversation. So I get fired up about this because I'm like, it's kind of hypocritical. But so are we, right? Right. But that's what really burns me about this. But I think that's why I have a lot of passion around it. So anyway, I know you're probably going to ask me, how does that happen? How do you make that happen? That's what I want to understand. That's the research that I think is worthy of undertaking, and asking, how do you attract more teachers of color to the profession? How do you attract more qualified people to the profession? We have to be willing to pay for that research, ask the question, and then invest in the strategy that comes as a result of that research.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of A Revolution in Education. I am your host, Jim McCue, and I am here with Sanjili and her husband, Vanessa Gilway, of Design for Change USA, which is a chapter of the Global Design for Change. It's an initiative empowering young people to create positive change in their communities. It's actually held in over 35 countries and involves more than 1 million or millions of students and teachers. Welcome both.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. And I am so grateful to have connected with both of you. I know several weeks back, and those that are listening to this podcast or viewing the video that is up on our stream, you've previously engaged with Kieran Bersethi of Design for Change that operates out of India. And I was so grateful to speak with her. And in so doing, I was able to connect with these leading educators in the space, or educator reformers, perhaps. But that's enough rambling from me. I wanted to offer this opportunity to both of you to ask, what is Design for Change, and how is it changed, or how has it grown over the course of the last year?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I'm happy to start. So Design for Change is a movement that helps students build empathy and take action on causes that they truly care about. And in the USA, one of our primary focuses is really about engaging students in the conversation around social justice, which is such a big, important topic right now, whether it be racial justice or climate action or equity in education. We want to provide educators a means to be able to engage their students in these conversations, but not only having the conversations, but also using our framework which is rooted in design thinking, to actually make a difference and take action. So when we originally started, Design for Change was just a framework: feel, imagine, do, share, to inspire students to take action. But in the US, we've been able to evolve that through technology and providing educators with resources such as podcasts, like the one we're on today, to really elevate and center student voice on topics that they care about. And then also using technology as a means to help students and support them in actually doing their projects. As given the pandemic, technology has played a very big role in our lives, and we are utilizing it in a way that helps students do the things that they really care about.
It's amazing, that agility and that responsiveness to the needs of students, especially as things change over time in education. It speaks volumes about the work that you're doing, and it's truly student-led. So I loved this quote on the website, and I'll bring it up here. In reference to the three themes that you mentioned: focus on racial justice, educational equity, and addressing things as it relates to climate change. Do you believe that third graders can shut down a drug house, or fifth graders can create a pipeline between farmers and food deserts? High school students can increase support for mental health at their school. Design for Change allows that to happen, that facilitation and that stewardship. Do you want to talk more about the model that you just presented to us and how students initiate that initial discovery or purpose around a particular project that they'd like to see manifested?
Absolutely. This process, feel, imagine, do, share, is a very simple design thinking framework, and it really demystifies design thinking, which at its core is a system to be able to solve complex problems. And so it was pioneered by visionaries at IDEO and Stanford Design School. But what our founder, Karen, has done, and you've heard in a previous podcast, is she's really distilled it down to 4 simple steps: feel, imagine, do, share. So feel is all about generating empathy. So understanding the root cause of an issue by actually talking to the people who are affected by the issue, because typically what we see all people do, not just children, not just teachers, is they want to jump in and force a solution, but not necessarily to a problem that exists. Sometimes we end up solving the wrong problems because we don't ask the right questions of the people who are affected by those issues. And so the feels really centers what we call the user, the person who you're trying to solve the problem for, and helps you build empathy and understand the issues from their own perspective. And from there, you kind of analyze the issues and what they're telling you from those by gathering those insights, and then you begin to imagine. This is about exploring all your wild and crazy and bold ideas, and then also beginning to distill them down into ideas that you feel like you can actually implement, giving your own parameters or constraints, and then critically evaluating them and picking a solution that you want to move forward with. And then do is all about the action. It's all about the implementation, right? So it's about testing out your idea by creating a first prototype, and then iterating on it by first gathering insights, and then continuing to test and continuing to fail. One of the things that we've forgotten how to do as a society is just fail and know it's okay, which is why design thinking is so great, because it allows you to be messy.
Yeah.
And just be in that process and be in that moment and allow yourself to be messy and know it's not going to be perfect the first time. And then once you implement your solution, it's time to reflect and all the hard work that you've done through this share stage, and then share back your project to really inspire others to also become involved. We don't want projects of our students to be the best kept secret, so we scream
it from the mountaintops. Yeah. I have 2 follow-ups on that. It's such a beautiful theory of action and the incorporation of continuous improvement, that iterative design and thinking about failing. But I want to be inclusive of our other participant on the call, someone that you know very well, an advisor, very passionate about design for change. Vanessa, I wanted you to open up about your experience in helping this tech side of building design for change on a national scale, and some of the work that you've done in prior experiences that have helped inform what you're doing now with Design for Change.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jim. I think one of the things that we're really passionate about at Design for Change is how to bring this model of design thinking and this really hard topic around equity and justice into the classroom in a much more tangible way, where a teacher can get up and running with engaging her students around really hard topics like social justice and educational equity and climate action in a tangible fashion. So we've built a technology platform that the teacher can get up and running within seconds, invite her students to it, do it over a hybrid learning environment, in person, out of the classroom, in the classroom. We all are familiar now with the many different ways that children are learning with technology, and be able to engage her kids with this design thinking process and be able to do that without a lot of upfront efforts. And we know that teachers are strapped for time. We know that they don't have a lot of room in their classroom to do additional things or bring new programs in. So we've really strived to use technology as a way to make it easily accessible for as many people as possible. And that's where as simply as just going into a website and signing up can get you going with the social justice program in your classroom. And that for me is really, really important for the success of Design for Change, because it's about using technology to reach people in ways that they haven't before.
I love hearing that. I currently work with many teachers in the Philadelphia area, and a lot of the concern for adding, I mean, it sounds like adding on supplementary items in terms of addressing racial justice and educational equity and climate action, because time is a difficulty managing that time, especially during the past year, and what data they are required to collect, and is it valid? And there are all of these other circumstances that seem very limiting, but this design, in terms of the ability to just sign on and be guided by the practices and the model that's offered by Design for Change, seems like such a great solution for some of those concerns, and for many students who just want to explore what's within their own community. I loved some of the stories of change listed on the website. I'm wondering from both of you, what were some of the most inspiring that you saw developed by students through this model, and how do you see it replicable in communities that aren't being served by this program currently?
Yeah, there's so many. It's hard to distill it down. One of the earlier stories that we saw come out of North Carolina actually had to do with the refugee community and access to food, because typically this particular refugee community has come to the United States and are now forced to live in, not forced to live, but they do live in food deserts. And so the students, our Design for Change students, recognized that that was an issue. And what they had done was work with a local farmer who had a lot of produce that, you know, he was not able to sell. And so they gleaned, so they collected all that produce, and they were able to redistribute the food back to the refugee community, who typically didn't have access to healthy produce, which they were used to from when they lived in their home country. So they created this amazing pipeline, which addressed issues around food waste, which addressed issues around hunger, which addressed issues around inclusiveness and making sure a refugee community actually felt like they were and are a part of the surrounding community. And so it was just a really powerful example of what's possible when we don't limit students and we take their lead on the things that they care about, and allowing them to actually explore these wild and crazy ideas, things that as adults, sometimes we don't lean into as much. So that was definitely one of my favorites. Vin, I don't know if you have a different favorite.
No, it's absolutely one of mine as well. I think another one that was so interesting, given what we're all dealing with right now, is that there was a group of kids in a school in New York who were interested in why so many children were getting the flu in their school. And they created a whole campaign called Stop the Spread. Sounds familiar. This is way before the pandemic, and actually used design thinking to understand that kids were leaving the bathroom without cleaning their hands, which of course is unhygienic. And so they worked on a whole campaign about cleanliness and hygiene and actually created their own soap and did all these great things to bring awareness to this issue of germs spreading within the classroom, which of course we're all very used to now.
Yeah, everybody's washing their hands as much as we can and being mindful of that. What a relevant project. I love this structure of feel, imagine, do, share, especially as it's so empowering to students to recognize that education doesn't stop just simply because they leave the four walls of their classroom. But I recognize that step one as empathy, which is so powerful to me because oftentimes when we think about the work being done in education, it gets stripped down to or isolated into a logistical scope and sequence. What are the standards? What are the procedural steps? Especially as a math educator, I've seen that happen, and it limits the autonomy of teachers. It strips student voice, and it makes education a very unpersonalized pursuit. And so we've seen the power of empathy as a starting point in terms of partnership, true development, and truly, like, if not part of the work, the work in and of itself. Can you talk more about the incorporation of these podcasts and why are you also starting with empathy?
I think it's so critical that we start with the voices of the people that are actually affected mostly by these issues. And so at Design for Change, we center everything we do around the global goals. Any project that a student does invariably falls into one of the global goals. And we want them to be thinking about the global goals in context of their own community. And to be able to do that, you first have to talk to people, right? You have to ask them, again, the right questions to solve the right problems. And design thinking embraces the user as somebody that you're not just designing for, but you're designing with. So they are along, not just for the ride, but they inform the entire process at every stage of Feel, Imagine, Do, Share. So it is critical to root everything that students do in our program in empathy. So through that journey, they're not just transforming their community or the people that they're trying to affect, but they themselves are being transformed. And it all starts with the heart. And so that's why we created the podcast, was exactly what you said. Education has been stripping students of their voice. They don't have a place to talk about the issues that they so deeply care about, and they don't have a clear path to create or implement any kind of action, because oftentimes through budget cuts or time in a teacher's day, service is lost. And the idea of service is lost. And so we're hoping to build that back into the mission of the schools. The heart of what all schools are teaching right now is that this idea of being a contributor of a community, not sometime in the future, but now. So the podcasts are really meant to center student voice and to build empathy into the classroom, so teachers have access to those voices and that access is a resource that they can bring to their students, immediately.
I love hearing that. Yeah. I'm interested because you had mentioned the difficulties in certain communities in being able to participate fully in this ecosystem of learning. And we could talk about rural communities. We can talk about communities that have lower SES. We could talk about communities maybe in an urban setting that just simply maybe transportation to school is difficult. But this technological piece allows for an integration and an engagement from the comfort of your own home. But there are still difficulties that have arisen and been amplified for certain student groups. And they have so much going on in terms of their personal lives and setting up that experience. I would love to hear more about how the design, your focus on design in this process informs how students stay engaged, because participation has been a very difficult thing for many teachers to ensure for all students. And so how is this solution addressing that dilemma?
Then do you want to?
Why don't you start? I'll pick it up.
Sure, yeah. So I think that the whole pandemic has revealed a lot of injustices in our system, and they've amplified them and highlighted them in a way that we haven't seen before. Technology has played a role in that, for at least for us, in that we could increase student participation by having a mechanism for teachers to engage with the program in a synchronous, asynchronous fashion, or live or in person. Regardless of their circumstances, they can all engage with Design for Change. That's something we've never had before. It's very new to us, and we're still learning. We're still very much in our own design process and learning process. And so the technology has allowed for increased engagement, and in all transparency, feel, imagine, do, share. That is something anyone can do. We call it sort of leveling the playing field, because you don't need much to engage with that process. It is, it makes the experience it's an experience that anybody can go through without too many resources, without money, without, being in a formalized school, without much transportation. It's just an experience that absolutely anybody can participate in. So our goal is to make it easier and easier for students to engage with that, and we're continuing to explore how to do that. I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add there.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is, and Sanjay, you mentioned this earlier, is the demystifying of it. Like, I think that it's such a hard concept for people that it's a little scary sometimes. And so part of our job is to make it something that anybody can do. And when you actually get into it, you realize that you're just doing things that all people do, which is be curious, be empathetic, ask questions, listen, innovate. And the great thing about seeing children do this is that they're really naturally good at it. They're naturally good at asking hard questions. We all know that as parents, you get hard questions sometimes. But even behind those hard questions is a level of curiosity about the world and a desire to do something about it, which is awesome. So we don't really think that we sometimes think about this word of empowerment. We're not really empowering kids to do anything. They already have the power. We're just laying the groundwork for it to happen, and letting it happen in a free, safe way.
I cannot wait for this episode to be published, just simply because I feel inspired. I want to thank you both for taking the time today to share with us a little bit more about Design for Change, how we can all use this sense of urgency that you've mentioned to manifest real, authentic, personalized change in our community that is student-led and that is naturally curious for them and is so integrated into their academic lives that creates such long-lasting impact for not just themselves, but for others. So in ending this conversation, I am truly grateful. I'm excited to see what is up next for Design for Change. And I hope that many of our listeners will be able to reach out. If they have questions, we will share any and all resources. Please, for those listening and viewing, go on the Design for Change website. It is truly inspiring. The model that's being offered and some of the videos are just so reinvigorating and so energizing during this time. So thank you both.
Thank you for letting us have this opportunity to share our work.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Thank you all for listening and viewing this episode 12 of A Revolution in Education. Again, to learn more about the Revolutionaries featured in this episode, please feel free to visit our website, arevolutionineducation.org. Tune in next week for a special edition with Kath Phrase, and follow us on Twitter at revolutionedu for updates. Have a great day.